The inaccurate tallies had showed that Joe Biden appeared to have beaten Trump by 3,000 votes in a county that is usually very red, a Republican stronghold, and it was soon found to be an error in Antrim County, but obviously spawned a litany of conspiracy theories, hence the involvement of the former president's outside legal circle.
Joe, Jackie, understanding that this reporting is very fresh, do we know if the January 6th Select Committee is looking into this?
That is a very good question. It's not something that we've been in touch with the committee spokesperson on just yet, but we do know that they've conducted over 400 interviews and have conducted some of their depositions and interviews with people who were involved with this effort. So it's likely that they might have some sense of what was going on, but we also know that some of our investigative work has been a few steps ahead of where the committee is at so far. So TBD.
So Jackie calls this shocking. It is important to be reminded that this is shocking, even in the midst of everything that the former administration did. How important was this idea that there was fraud in this specific county to the big lie and Trump's whole effort to stop the election from being certified?
It really exemplifies, if this happened, it really does exemplify sort of the pressure campaign that former President Trump was engaged in. I remember in November rushing to the White House because there were Michigan officials who had been summoned by former President Trump to come into the White House. And of course, we don't know exactly what the president said to those officials, but that was an example of the president. This was, of course, after it was clear that he had lost the election. This is the president, again, sort of trying to make sure that he was making it very clear to local officials that he wanted them to do everything that they could to try to make sure that he could hold on to power. I also think, while we don't know, of course, specifically whether or not the January 6th committee is looking into this specific event, what we do know is that there's a gold team, because there's a color-coded team in the investigation. The gold team is looking specifically at whether any plans that former President Trump had with members of Congress or pressure campaigns that he tried to carry out with local officials and with any sort of Justice Department officials. So it's in their purview that they would be looking at local officials and local sort of local attempts to try to get voting machines, or to try to find 11,000 votes, as the former president told them, the officials in Georgia, to do. So in other words, I think that this really does, in some ways, get at the idea that this was not sort of a sort of him just tweeting. This was him sort of really looking at different states and saying, how can I extract sort of power from these different states?
David, it goes without saying, it should go without saying, that a campaign asking a prosecutor to seize voting machines with no evidence of wrongdoing is both incredibly inappropriate and incredibly unusual, and yet somehow just a part of their playbook.
Yeah, look, it is easy to think of January 6th as this event that just kind of happened and then spun out of control. January 6th was the culmination of a very serious attempt to undermine the certification of a free and fair election and to engage in what is rightfully called a failed authoritarian coup. That is the seizure of ballot boxes. That is prevention of certification. That is undue influence and corrupt influence on state officials from certifying. That is submitting false electors to Washington, D.C. to certify Donald Trump and not Joe Biden, and ultimately unleashing the violence we saw on January 6th. All of this reporting that continues to come out actually supports that this was a very complex attempt at a coup that involved multiple elements. And this is where not only the emphasis of the J6 Commission in Congress is so important, but the investigative authority of the Attorney General himself.
Unish, I want to turn to what's happening with the Republican Party and this RNC resolution. The Washington Post reports that former President Donald Trump called RNC Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel on Saturday to congratulate her on the resolution. So the resolution seems to have put basically every Republican in Congress in a pretty uncomfortable spot. You have Kevin McCarthy literally running from a reporter. I guess he decided he couldn't outrun Garrett Haake. He's very tall. Meanwhile, the former president is happy. He's calling the head of the RNC to congratulate her. As we return to this question, which we return to over and over again, about the former president's grip on the GOP, what does this dynamic show us?
What this dynamic shows us is that former President Trump continues to have a tightened grip on the GOP. he has now convinced the Republican National Committee to call what was clearly an insurrection, clearly an attack on our Capitol, legitimate political discourse. And you now have elected officials, Republicans who are, and there aren't that many of them, but the few and far between of them, Lindsey Graham and Senator McConnell, who are at least saying, okay, this has gone too far. But it really, to me, crystallizes that the Trump view of January 6th is the one that the RNC and that the Republican Party is by and large embracing. And it also it's fascinating because this is happening when we see some polls showing that there are some people who are now starting to blame former President Trump less for the January 6th Capitol attack, where, of course, he was the one who told people to go to the Capitol. Of course, the Trump administration, the Trump officials, they say, oh, they wanted him to go, they wanted people to go peacefully. That being said, I think this really does underscore there's a rift in the GOP, but the power, the sort of ability to affect the official rhetoric of the party, that continues to be in the hands of former President Trump. And I also am very interested, though, in the fact that there was a little bit of changing of language here, according to the New York Times.
Yes.
At one point, before they were going to use legitimate, they were going to use nonviolent, which really just, I mean, it makes your head spin because you're thinking, would you ever describe this as nonviolent when people literally died at this Capitol attack?
Right, it was supposed to say non-violent, David, non-violent and legal, and then they decided to make it legitimate. I mean, was that because they knew that the split screen of our reading the censure and saying they're calling it non-violent while we showed all of the images of violence wouldn't sit well with voters? Or was it that they wanted to make the case that this was in fact legitimate? What does that word switch tell you?
I do think they were sensitive to trying to win the day with their narrative. And here is the great lie that the Republicans are engaged in right now. Look, in politics, some of the greatest deceptions include a kernel of truth. The kernel of truth is that across America, there were disenchanted voters from November that were engaged in legitimate political discourse. That was not the face of the January 6th violent insurrection where the U.S. Senate was breached. People were looking to hang the Vice President of the United States. The certification of the election was delayed, and it resulted in multiple deaths. With the RNC, this is the big lie that they're going to do. They're going to convince you this was legitimate political discourse. But there's a disconnect there, because what they're suggesting is that the J6 committee is investigating legitimate political discourse. No, they're not. They're not investigating nonviolent participants in our political process. They are investigating those who engaged in violence. And so to suggest that somehow Kinzinger and Cheney are attacking Americans engaged in legitimate political discourse is the great deception that includes only a kernel of truth. It's a shameful moment for the Republican Party, a shameful moment for those of McCarthy and others who are going to continue to perpetuate this deception from now through November.
Jackie, when you think about the numbers that Yamiche was referencing, and I think we have them, I want to pull them up. This is a Pew poll out this week showing that just 43% of people think Trump bears a lot of responsibility for January 6th. That's down from 52% last year. I think Yamiche's analysis of that stands. What I wonder looking at those numbers, Jackie, is we know part of the Trump strategy here has been to continue to push back those public hearings we are waiting on from the January 6th committee. When you talk to members of the committee, when you talk to their spokespeople, is it your sense that they believe that once they start having witnesses in the seat where people are able to hear directly from people who are in these rooms, that once they are showing those text messages on screen, those documents, those pieces of paper that were taped together, that all of a sudden the American people are going to begin to reconsider who was truly responsible for what happened on that horrific day?
Yeah, and I promise you I'll answer that question, but on the topic of political discourse, really quick, I think it's important to make the point that regardless of whether or not the word nonviolent was in there, for what happened around January 6th and the lead up to January 6th and the actual violence on January 6th, I think that there are some questions about the distinctions there. Whether or, of course, the violence is to be condemned, and that is the clarification that we heard the RNC later make. But these actions that were taken around January 6th that encouraged the insurrectionists to actually go and breach the Capitol, that is, by the account of most legal scholars, unconstitutional actions. It's been viewed as extremely problematic and and detrimental to the health of our democracy. So I think, this word of whether or not the word nonviolent was included, I think, this is a stamp of clear approval that all of the actions and the scheming and the legal coordination and the attempts to unconstitutionally overturn the results of the election, that this is a clear mark from Trump and the RNC that they viewed this all as legitimate. As for the tactics and the approach that the hearing is taking, that the committee is taking towards these hearings, they view them as really important. We have reported recently that the timeline has been pushed back because of the delays, as you noted, that have happened in the courts. But I think it's still important to point out that actually the courts, compared to the past few investigations we've seen, the Mueller investigation, Ukraine, and the last two impeachments, the courts have acted remarkably fast. The courts have, I think, seemingly wised up to the former president's approach and tactics, and they've moved fairly quickly, at least when we're talking about when it comes to things that are being extensively litigated. So yes, things have been pushed back, but I think the committee is largely on track, and there is a keen awareness that they don't really have the option of not being on track in the case that Democrats end up losing the majority in November.
Jackie Alamani, Yamiche Alcindor, thank you both so much for starting us off. David Jolly, you are staying with us. When we come back, more and more Democratic governors are saying it's time to lift mask mandates. New York